The morning the last hay broker laughed at her. It was a Tuesday in late July of 2019, and the sky had gone the color of old tin by 7 in the morning. Not a storm color, a dry color. The kind of flat metallic light that means the moisture has simply quit the air and moved on to somewhere it was more appreciated. The thermometer on the north side of the equipment shed read 81 degrees at 6:45, and it was still climbing. The creek that ran along the east fence had been reduced to a series of disconnected brown pools, each one shrieking a little more every morning, and the pasture grass had gone from green to gold to a kind of pale, exhausted gray that crackled when you walked through it. That was the summer, that was the country. And that was the morning a man in a truck that had never seen a muddy road rolled his window down at the end of her lane and told her in a polite and certain voice that carrying 11 brood mares through a drought of that severity on 43 acres of played-out hill ground was not a plan. It was a sentiment. He said it not unkindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes to be. So obvious it barely needs saying. Then he rolled his window back up and drove away, and the dust his tires raised hung in the still air for a long time after he was gone, because there was no wind to move it anywhere. Her name was not important to the story, or rather it was important only to her, and she was not the kind of woman who needed the story told about her by name. What mattered was the ground she stood on and what she knew about it that the hay broker did not. She was 63 years old that summer. She had worked this same ground since she was 19, when she came to it as a young wife, with strong hands and a very clear sense of what she was getting into, which was more than most people could say. She had buried her husband on it 11 years prior. She had watched 3 of her neighbors sell out, and watched the ground they'd sold get broken into 5-acre ranchettes, with white vinyl fencing and horses that wore blankets in October. She had watched the county agent drive out twice in 2 years to tell her, with columns of data and a laminated soil map, that her east-facing slopes were effectively exhausted and her water table was in long-term decline. He was not wrong about the slopes. She did not argue with him about the slopes. She just did not tell him everything she knew, partly because she was not certain yet, and partly because her grandmother had told her once, in a voice so flat it sounded like a fact of physics, that you do not spend a thing you haven't finished counting. That line had been living in her head for 40 years. She had not finished counting. I want to be honest about how I came into this story, because I have a habit of arriving late to things that deserve earlier attention, and this was no exception. I had known this woman at least well enough to wave from a truck window for going on 16 years. We shared a road, though not a fence line. I knew she ran mares. I knew she was considered by most of the coffee counter crowd at the co-op to be stubborn in the specific way that older single women on marginal ground are described as stubborn. Which is to say, people said it with a mixture of something like admiration and something like pity, and could not always tell the two apart. I had heard the hay broker story second-hand by noon of the same day it happened, because by noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. In the diner version, she had 11 mares, and no water, and no plan, and no sense, and somebody's cousin who ran an outfit twice the size had already offered her a fair price for the whole string, and she had declined it. That last part was true. The rest of it was approximately true in the way that second-hand stories are approximately true, which is to say, the facts were present, but the meaning had been removed and replaced with something more comfortable. I did not say anything at the counter that morning. I went home and looked at my own dry pasture and thought about her mares. And I put it out of my mind, which is the first postponement I will own here and not the last. The mares themselves were not remarkable to look at if you were looking for remarkable. They were big-bodied, older, the kind of horses that carry weight in their neck and hindquarter and move with a slow, deliberate economy that younger horses don't have and can't be taught. 3 of them were over 20. The youngest was 14. Not one of them was what the market would have called valuable in any quick or obvious sense. She had been offered, in aggregate, just over $9,000 for all 11 by the man in the clean truck, which worked out to less than $820 a head for animals she had bred and raised, and in several cases, had on the property for more than a decade. She had said no with the same flat affect she used for most things she had already decided. What the broker could not know, because he was not watching the mares the way she was that those animals had been doing something specific and consistent for the better part of 6 weeks, ever since the creek dropped and the east pools went shallow. They had been drifting every afternoon between 2 and 4 to a particular low corner of the northeast pasture, a corner that was rocky and rough and that had never held water in any of the years she had watched it. Not in any wet spring she could remember. They were not grazing there. The grass was no better in that corner than anywhere else. They were simply going there and standing, and some of them were pawing occasionally at a flat shelf of exposed limestone, and then drifting back. She had watched this for 6 weeks and said nothing about it to anyone. The reason she said nothing was the same reason her grandmother had told her not to spend a thing before she'd finished counting it. She was counting. And she had in her grandmother's cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the back room a marbled composition notebook with a cracked spine and a rubber band around it that had gone brittle and left a brown mark on the cover. And in that notebook, written in her grandmother's careful, slightly right-leaning hand, there were 47 pages of observations about the ground of that farm. Water tables checked by hand with a weighted line dropped into the hand-dug well behind the old milk barn. Rainfall totals recorded by month going back to 1961. Soil descriptions by pasture section, written in the plain language of a woman who had never taken an agronomy course but had paid close enough attention to the ground for long enough that the language she'd invented for it was more precise than most of what gets printed in extension bulletins. And on page 31 of that notebook, in a section labeled Northeast Corner in pencil that had gone the color of old wood, there was a single line that had been underlined twice and followed by 3 question marks. The line read, "Water comes up here in July when it goes down everywhere else. Check the rock shelf. What is below?" She had read that line for the first time the winter after her husband died. 11 years ago, sitting in the back room in the cold with the cedar chest open and the notebook on her knee. She had read it and she had sat with it for a long time, and then she had put the notebook back and closed the chest and gone to make supper, because she was not ready for what the line meant and she was not going to chase a half-formed thing in the middle of grief. That was the first postponement. I tell you this because she told me later, and because she told it on herself with the same flat honesty she applied to everything, and because I think it is important to know that even the patient people postpone the important things, even the ones who are right. By the second week of August 2019, the drought had deepened to the point where the county had issued a voluntary restriction on irrigation draws from the creek watershed, which was a polite way of saying the creek was gone, and if you were still running a surface pump, you were pulling mud. She had not been using the creek for primary water since June, which was itself something the county agent had noted on his clipboard with visible confusion, because her alternative water source was listed on the property survey as a cistern and one hand-dug well, and the well was the same one her grandmother had measured in that notebook. And by August, a hand-dug well on hill ground in a dry year is not a water source. That inspires confidence in a man with a clipboard. She told him it was sufficient. He wrote something down and drove away. By noon, the diner had a version of that conversation too, and in that version, she was drawing the well down to mud and would be hauling water by September. She was not hauling water. In September, the well was holding. She had not yet told anyone why she thought it was holding. What she had done, quietly and without announcing it, was go back to the cedar chest in late July. She had taken the notebook out and read page 31 again, and then she had read all 47 pages, slowly, over 3 evenings, sitting under the single bulb in the back room with a cup of tea that went cold. Her grandmother had recorded, across multiple July entries from different years, a consistent observation. That in drought years, the northeast corner of the pasture showed surface moisture along the rock shelf when every other part of the farm was dry. Not pooled water, not a spring in any visible sense. Moisture. The kind that makes the rock face sweat and turns the low grass there a shade greener than it has any right to be in July. Her grandmother had not known what to make of it. She had written, in one entry from July of 1974, "What is feeding this?" and in another from July of 1981, asked Harold about the rock. Harold had apparently not known either, or if he had not written it down. The question marks remained. The 3 weeks I will take to tell what came next passed slowly for her, I think, though she did not say so directly. She went to the northeast corner on a Monday morning in the first week of August, early before the heat built, and she brought with her a pointed iron bar that had been hanging on the equipment shed wall for as long as she could remember, with her grandfather's initials scratched into the flat end with a nail. She had not brought anyone with her. She did not consider the possibility that she might need anyone. She went to the rock shelf, and she pressed her hand against it, and it was cool. It was noticeably, distinctly cool in a way that limestone in August in a dry summer is not. The surface was damp. There was a thin line of moss along the lower edge of the shelf that was still alive and green while everything around it was burned. The mares were in the north end of the pasture, about 200 yards off, and 4 of them had raised their heads and were watching her with the calm, measuring attention that older horses apply to things they consider their own business. She took the iron bar and she felt along the base of the rock shelf until she found a horizontal crack about 1.5 inches wide running roughly 11 feet from east to west, and she pressed the bar into it and worked it, not to break anything but to feel what was behind it. What she felt was give. What she heard, faint and unmistakable, was a low wet sound, not dripping, something under pressure, something moving. She did not tell anyone that day either. She went back to the notebook. She read her grandmother's entries again, and this time she paid attention to a line she had skimmed before, from July of 1968, which read, "The rock runs under the fence line to the east, and I believe it keeps going." Her grandmother had drawn a rough sketch in the margin, a horizontal line, with a question mark extending past what was clearly meant to represent the east fence. The east fence bordered what had been, in 1968, a neighboring farm of similar size and similar ground. In 2019, that farm was divided into 3 separate parcels under 3 separate owners, one of which was my own 41 acres, and I shared a fence line with her on its west edge. I did not know any of this yet. I was going about my summer in the ordinary way of people who do not know they are adjacent to something significant. It was a Thursday in the 3rd week of August when she came down my lane unannounced, which she had not done in all the years we had been neighbors in the loose, road-sharing sense. She knocked, and I came to the door, and she stood on the porch with the notebook under her arm, and said she had something to show me, and asked if I had time. I told her I had time, because I am not so busy that I cannot make time for a 63-year-old woman with a cracked notebook standing on my porch in a drought. We drove back up to her place in my truck, and she took me to the northeast corner, and she showed me the rock shelf and the crack and the moisture and the moss, and I crouched down and put my hand against the stone the way she had, and I will tell you that it was startling how cool it was. Not cool the way shade is cool, cool the way underground is cool. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and she opened the notebook to page 31 and held it out. I read the line. "Water comes up here in July when it goes down everywhere else. Check the rock shelf. What is below?" I read it twice. She let me read it twice without saying anything, which is its own kind of courtesy. Then she said quietly that she thought it kept going east, and she thought I ought to know that before either of us did anything else. I will own that my first response was not the right one. My first response was the ordinary one, which was to think about what it would cost and how long it would take, and whether I was in a position, financially and physically, to dig up a limestone shelf on a fence line in August, on the word of a dead woman's notebook. I am 67 years old, and I have been wrong about ground before. And being wrong about ground at 67 has a different quality than being wrong about ground at 35. At 35, you get back up and try again. At 67, you think harder before you go down. I said I would look into it, and she nodded, and we drove back, and she thanked me, and I went home and put my hat on the hook by the door and stood in the kitchen for a while and thought about what cool rock in August means. What I did next was the thing I should have done first, and the reason I didn't do it first is exactly what she had been patient enough to avoid, which was the reflex to call the modern credential thing before you have finished thinking with your own eyes. I called the county extension office. I described what I had seen in general terms, without mentioning the notebook or the mares or the 11 years of postponed reading. The man I spoke to was thorough and well-meaning, and he told me in about 4 minutes that fractured limestone aquifers in our county are common, that most of the productive ones had been mapped in the 1992nd hydrological survey, and that any significant seep on uncharted ground. He offered to email me the relevant section of the survey. I said yes. He did. I read it that evening. My northeast fence line was in what the survey called a low-confidence zone for subsurface water, which the accompanying notes defined as ground where insufficient data exists to confirm or exclude a productive formation. That is a technical way of saying they hadn't tested it. They had looked at the geology on paper and made an educated assumption and moved on, and the assumption was that there was nothing worth finding. The survey was 26 years old and had been conducted in a wet October, which is the worst possible time to find a dry season seep, because in a wet October everything looks adequately watered and nothing is showing you its July face. I printed that page and wrote, "Not tested" in the margin in pencil and went to bed. And I lay there for a while thinking about the mares standing at the rock shelf every afternoon between 2 and 4, patient and certain, in a summer that had made everyone else frantic and uncertain. The next morning I was out before 5:30, and the light was still thin and gray, and the air had that particular quality it gets in a dry August morning that is almost cool but not quite, the kind of almost cool that reminds you what October will feel like and makes you miss it before it arrives. I walked my east fence line from the road to the creek bed, about 1,100 feet, and I walked it slowly, the way you walk a fence when you're not in a hurry and you're looking for something you can't name yet. The limestone shelf that she had shown me on her side of the fence continued on my side. It wasn't visible as a shelf in the same way, because on my side it had been covered at some point in the past with about 8 inches of fill dirt that had been graded smooth probably when the property was subdivided. The fill had settled unevenly over the years, and there was a low, sinuous depression running roughly along the line where the rock would be, maybe 14 feet east of the fence. The depression was subtle enough that you would not notice it if you were not looking for it. I had walked that fence line probably 60 times over 16 years and had never once registered it. The grass in the depression was a slightly different green. Not dramatically different. Slightly? Enough? I went back to my truck and got the tile probe I keep behind the seat, which is a fiberglass rod with a pointed steel foot that I use for checking drain tile without digging. And I walked the depression and probed it every 8 feet. At 2/3 of the way down the line, at a point roughly 710 feet south of the road, the probe went through the fill layer and into what felt like wet material below. Not saturated clay wet. The probe met almost no resistance after the fill layer and went to its full 60-inch depth without hitting solid bottom. I pulled it back up, and the lower 18 inches were dark and cold, and they smelled the way a deep well smells, which is mineral and clean and has nothing of the surface world in it. I stood there for a moment with the probe in my hand And I thought about the survey from 1993 that said not enough data. And I thought about her grandmother's notebook that said, water comes up here in July when it goes down everywhere else. And I thought about the mares who had been standing at that rock shelf every afternoon for 6 weeks in a summer when every other animal on every other farm in the county was being hauled water twice a day. The field does not care who believes in it. That is not her grandmother's line. Or, not exactly. That is mine. Or, it became mine. That morning, standing in a dry August pasture with a wet probe in my hand and the first thin light coming flat across the hill from the east. But it felt like something that had been true before I said it, which is the best kind of truth. I called a man named Gareth, who had been drilling water wells in our county for 31 years, and who had, in my experience, the specific quality of honesty that comes from having been wrong in front of people enough times that he had given up the comfort of false certainty. I had used him twice before, once for a dry hole that cost me $1,400, and once for a productive well that cost me $3,000, and he had been equally straightforward about both outcomes before and after. I told him what I had found and described the geology and mentioned the probe depth and the smell. He was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said he would come out Thursday. He came out Thursday morning with a younger man I didn't know and a truck loaded with what he needed to do a basic assessment, and he walked my fence line with me, and he walked her northeast corner with her, and the three of us stood at the rock shelf, and he put his hand against it the same way I had, and he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the moss, he looked at the crack, he took a small instrument from his vest pocket and held it near the crack and read something off it that I couldn't see, and he was quiet again. He looked at the mares, who were in the north pasture, and watching us with their customary composed attention. He said slowly that what he was looking at had the characteristics of a pressurized fracture seep in a confined limestone formation, and that the question was depth and volume, and that neither of those things could be answered without drilling. He looked at me. He looked at her. He said it looked substantial. That was the word. Substantial. He said it quietly, and he did not elaborate on it. And he did not smile when he said it, because Gareth is not a man who smiles at preliminary evidence, and I respected him for that. She looked at the notebook in her hand, and she looked back at him. And she said in the same flat voice she used for everything, that her grandmother had been wondering about it since 1968. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the rock. He said 51 years was a long time for a question to sit unanswered. She said she supposed it was. They stood there together in the August heat, the two of them, and the rock and the question. And I stood a little back and did not say anything because there was nothing to add and I knew enough to know it. The drilling took place over 4 days in the first week of September, the week before the first real cool front came through and laid the summer down properly. Gareth drilled on my side of the fence first, at the point where my probe had found the cold wet material, 710 feet south of the road. He hit fractured limestone at 44 feet. At 61 feet, he hit what he later described to me as a significant void in the formation, and when he put his bit through the floor of the void, the drill string dropped 7 inches, in a way that made his younger man step back from the rig. He cased it and tested it over a day and a half, and the yield came in at 18 gallons per minute sustained over a 4-hour drawdown test, which in our county and in our geology is not a kitchen sink number. 18 gallons per minute is a community number. It is a number that means more than one household and more than one pasture. He drilled the second well on her northeast corner 3 days later, cased it into the same formation, and it tested at 11 gallons per minute, which brought the combined demonstrated yield of the two access points to 29 gallons per minute out of what appeared to be the same connected system. He came and found me late on the 4th day, after the second test was done, and he stood in my driveway with his hat in his hand, and he said the word again. Substantial. He said it like it had the same weight the second time, which it did. I want to tell you what happened next with the numbers, because the numbers are part of the story in the way that concrete things always are part of the real story. And I think leaving them out would be a dishonesty by omission. A hydrogeologist came out in October, hired jointly between the two of us and the two parcel owners to the east who shared the same geology. And she spent 3 days doing what hydrogeologists do, which is measure and map and calculate the things that a lifetime of observation can point toward, but not quantify. Her preliminary report, delivered in November of 2019, described a confined limestone aquifer of moderate size with a recharge zone that appeared to extend under portions of at least 4 properties, including mine and the farm to the north. The estimated productive area of the formation was described as sufficient to support agricultural water needs for multiple users on a sustained basis, pending further characterization, which is geological language, for this is real, but we want to be careful about what we promise. The legal work took through the following spring, because water rights in our state are the kind of thing that lawyers approach the way farmers approach a wet field in April, carefully and with appropriate footwear. By June of 2020, there was a shared use agreement in place between 4 property owners, drawn up plainly and sensibly, giving each party access to the formation proportional to their acreage and their demonstrated historical need, and establishing a cooperative monitoring arrangement that Gareth agreed to oversee at a fee that was, in his words, less than it ought to be, but the project interested him. What it cost her to drill her access well was $4,800, which she had, as she told me without drama, been saving for something like this for longer than I knew. She said she had not known what she was saving it for until August. She said her grandmother's line about not spending what you haven't finished counting had applied to the money as much as to the water. I thought about that for a while. The mares drank from the new trough connected to the well. Starting the 3rd week of September, and on the first morning it was filled and running. 2 of the older mares, the 2 that have been most consistent about visiting the rock shelf through the summer, stood at the trough for a long time, and then stood quietly near it for the better part of an hour after they had finished drinking, in the way that animals behave around something they recognize before you gave it a name. I watched them from the fence, and I did not say anything about it to anyone for a while, because some things deserve to be kept close until you know what to do with them. My neighbor to the north, who had watched the whole summer's proceedings with the polite skepticism of a man who has seen too many dry holes and overconfident drillers, came down the road in late October, window rolled down in the cool air, and slowed at my gate. He looked at the wellhead. He looked at the trough. He said in a voice that was careful and measured and offered nothing it hadn't already decided to give, that he had noticed the grass along my east line was looking better than it had any right to look this late in the year. I told him the water table had some help. He looked at the field for a moment. He said that was something. He nodded once, the way men who have been certain of a thing and then been adjusted by evidence tend to nod, which is less like agreement and more like the closing of a small account. Then he drove on. By noon, the diner had a version of that conversation too, but by then the version they had of her story had changed considerably, and it was a better and more accurate version than the one from July. And she was in it the way she deserved to be in it, which was as someone who had been paying attention when the rest of the county was just waiting for rain. The mares are all still on that 43 acres. 3 of them are over 23 now. The youngest turned 16 in the spring. The hay broker has not been back down that lane. The hand dug, well, her grandmother, measured in that notebook, still holds, because now it understands it is not alone down there in the dark, that the formation it draws from is larger than anyone had thought and more persistent than the 1993 survey was willing to say. The notebook is back in the cedar chest, but she takes it out now and then and adds to it in her own hand, in pencil, in the same right-leaning script that her grandmother apparently also used, because some things pass through families the way water passes through limestone, finding the same channels over and over, not because they were planned, but because the geology was right. I think about that line on page 31 sometimes, the one with the 2 underlines and the 3 question marks. Water comes up here in July when it goes down everywhere else. Check the rock shelf. What is below? Her grandmother wrote that in the summer of 1968 and did not live long enough to know the answer. Her granddaughter read it in the winter of 2008 and was not ready. She read it again in the summer of 2019 and walked out with a pointed iron bar and her grandfather's initials scratched into the end of it and found the answer in a crack in a rock shelf on a dry Tuesday morning while 11 old mares stood 200 yards away and watched her with the patient certainty of animals that already knew. The difference between a problem and a gift is sometimes only whether you were willing to stay with it until it showed you what it was. That is not her grandmother's line, or not exactly. But I believe her grandmother would have agreed with it, and I believe the woman who reads her grandmother's notebook by a single bulb in the back room would agree with it, and I believe the mares would agree with it. If you asked them in the right language, which is the language of water and time, and the willingness to stand at a rock shelf in August and wait for what is below to make itself known to you. If you have your own piece of ground that is hiding something, or your own old notebook with a line in it that has been waiting for the right dry summer to become an answer, I would like to hear about it in the comments. This channel moves slow, but it gets where it is going. If this story meant something to you, subscribe and we will keep going.